nomination is from Virginia Tech University, and she'll be presenting some information on dung beetles, on nutrient cycling, and forage growth for Alpaca. Elin?
Hey, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to let me share my research with you. Like she said, today I'll be talking about the benefits of dung beetles on nutrient cycling and forage growth in alpaca pastures. I'll start with a brief introduction of alpacas and nutrient cycling in pastures, and a little bit about dung beetles, outline the objective, talk about how we set up the experiment, some of the results, and share some management implications. So one of probably the most common question I get when I talk about my research is why alpacas, so I'll try to back them up a little bit here. There's been an 81% increase in their population in the U.S. since 2000, and Virginia has the 8th highest alpaca population. So far, the focus has been on breeding stock, but the fiber market is viable in the U.S. with prices ranging from $30 to $50 per pound of fiber. Another reason for their popularity is that they're well adapted to small acreages and have relatively low nutrient requirements compared to other ruminant livestock. And this is related to having more efficient urea recycling and a longer rumen retention time. And in our experience, we've also seen them to be like very hardy and have very limited parasite issues. Unfortunately, a lot of their management recommendations have been based on other small ruminants so far, and we need some more information to make the system profitable. And one thing that can make any livestock grazing system more profitable is by building stronger nutrient cycling in pastures, especially with the volatile fertilizer prices lately. This is a very oversimplified outline of nutrient cycling in pastures. You start with the grazing animal, and they consume the forage, and about 90% of what they're taking in comes out, and the animal waste along with plant residue gets broken down by the soil organisms into forms that can be taken back up by the forage. And there's a lot of different soil organisms, but today I'm going to focus on dung beetles. A little bit of biology on dung beetles. They have 3 different nesting types, and from, I guess it's your left to right, there's tunnelers, and they excavate tunnels under the dung pat and lay their eggs in brood balls and bury them in the bottom of these brood chambers. And then the dwellers in the middle, they lay their eggs within the dung pat, and the larvae complete their cycle in the dung pat or just at the soil surface. And then the rollers on the far right here, those are the ones you're seeing on Discovery Channel. They get all the fame. They're the ones that fight over the dung balls, but they make their dung balls and roll them off and bury them away from the dung pat. And in the mid-Atlantic and southeast, for sure, the tunnelers are the most abundant and probably the most important as far as benefits to the pasture nutrient cycling. So some of the benefits we get from that nesting activity include an increased rate of nutrient cycling, and that comes from actually incorporating the dung into the soil where the microbes can further break that down. And then the tunneling activity creates macropores that increase infiltration, permeability, and water holding capacity in the soils. And those first 2 points help enhance forage growth. There's been several studies done on this, and the results have shown anywhere from 8 to 44% yield increase with dung beetles. The value of dung beetles has been looked into by a couple different folks. Losey and Vaughn out of Cornell estimate the benefits from dung beetles to be around $38 million per year. And then Fincher out of Texas, he sees the potential to be closer to $2 billion, but everything's bigger in Texas, right? So all the research that I showed you there that's been done previously was done with cattle dung. So our objective was to evaluate the impact of dung beetle activity on soil nutrients and the growth of a common summer annual grass using alpaca dung. We did this by setting up a greenhouse study, and we took 8-inch pots and lined them with autoclave bags to prevent soil and nutrient loss, and filled them with 7 pounds of soil. We tested the soil for nutrients and added phosphorus and potassium based on soil test recommendations. It was a randomized complete block design with 4 reps, and we repeated the experiment twice. There were 7 different treatments. We had our control, which had no nitrogen, a dung only, and then dung plus 5 pairs of Onthophagus taurus, which is our most common species that we found in the alpaca pastures. And then also we had a dung with field colonization, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we set that up in the next couple slides. And then we had 3 different nitrogen rate treatments, 40, 80, and 120 pounds per acre of nitrogen, so that we could create a response curve. So we had to figure out how much dung we wanted to add to these pots, and we based this on the average alpaca dung event. So I actually went out and measured 30 fresh events by outlining them with acetate paper and sending it through a leaf area meter to get the area and weighed each one. And the average we got was 150 grams of dung and 112 centimeters squared, so that's what we used on the pots. And this is what our field colonization treatment looked like. It was set up in the alpaca pasture. I dug holes in the ground and placed the pots in the ground with the dung on them and left them for 24 hours to allow for both day and night flying dung beetles to colonize the pots. And also during this time, I set out these dung-baited pitfall traps to see what the dung beetle population was like during that 24 hours, so we could get an idea of which species might be in the pots. We chose crabgrass for this study because it's a common summer annual in the mid-Atlantic region. We evenly seeded 25 seeds in each pot and thinned them to 14 seedlings. We waited till they got to early head and harvested to a 4-inch residual height and let it regrow for a second and final harvest. From that, we got yield data for both harvests and then a final soil nutrient analysis. The statistical analysis we used was a general linear model procedure from SAS, and we did our mean separation using Fisher's protected least significant difference. So we actually saw no treatment effects on the soil nutrients, and this conflicts previous studies that have used the same sandy loam soil and the same dung beetles, and we might have not seen any difference because we used alpaca dung instead of cattle dung, and we also used less dung. All right, this graph is our yield graph. On the x-axis, we have the harvests, and the y-axis is dry matter yield in grams per pot. In our first harvest, you can see that the field treatment had a significantly higher yield than the control or the dung only, and the Onthophagus taurus was significantly higher than the control, but not significantly higher from the dung alone. In our second harvest, there was no treatment effects on yield, and our total harvest, by adding the two together, all the treatments that contained dung were significantly higher than the control, but not significantly different from each other. This graph shows our plant available nitrogen. On the x-axis is our nitrogen rate in pounds per acre, and the y-axis is the shoot dry weight in grams per pot. The line we've created is our response curve to nitrogen, and from that curve we use the equation to figure out the estimated plant available nitrogen provided by those dung treatments. So in the blue there we have the dung only estimated 68 pounds of plant available nitrogen per acre, the Onthophagus taurus at 79 pounds, and the field up there at 113 pounds of plant available nitrogen. All right, to kind of summarize, I want to make this point that it's really difficult to make any firm conclusions when you're taking one part of the system out and just looking at that, because there's a lot going on that we're ignoring. But even though we just took out the dung beetles, we can conclude that dung beetle activity can contribute to increased forage growth, like we saw in that first harvest where at field levels there was a significant increase in yield over just dung alone. And just to drive it home, dung beetles are just one part of this system, but there's a lot of things we could do to help manage our pastures to optimize soil organism activity, and that's for all soil organisms. One thing we can do is to manage our inputs to mitigate negative impacts, and one example of this is with our pest management. There are certain dewormers, for instance, that are toxic to dung beetle populations, but others that are relatively low toxicity on non-target organisms. Another thing we can do is to be conscious about creating a suitable habitat for soil organisms, and we can do that by managing our residual plant material and plant residues to keep feeding our soil organisms. And another thing we can do in any livestock system is to encourage uniform nutrient distribution to get the effectiveness of the soil organism activity over a larger area of your pasture. And one thing you can do with that would be rotational stocking. So, as a final note, fertilizer prices are very volatile right now, and if we can just build the nutrient cycles in our pastures and put these organisms to work, then we can have more profitable systems. And I'll leave you with some dung beetle humor. There's plenty of it out there, and take any questions.
Any questions for Elin?
You had Arnaudin parts that you put in the plants, the more controlled things with the field. Did you end up with different species from the field version?
Yeah. Okay, he wants to know if we had different species other than Onthophagus taurus, or in addition to Onthophagus taurus, in our field treatments. And yeah, we assumed that we did. From the pitfall traps, I collected about 8 different species during that 24 hours on both trials.
Where livestock are experiencing parasite control chemically, does that affect the dung beetle population?
Can you repeat that?
If the livestock that are the parasites being controlled chemically are grazing in these pastures, will it affect the dung beetle?
All right, if the livestock are being treated for parasites, does that affect the dung beetle population? And it definitely can, and repeated use of some of the more toxic ones to the non-target organisms can definitely bring down your dung beetle population. But there's certain ones that you can use that don't harm the dung beetles as much, like moxidectin is less toxic than ivermectin.
You did a study in the greenhouse. How do you think your results could be affected compared to what you're doing in the field?
I think they would be similar. Some previous studies have done both a field experiment and a greenhouse experiment, and there's usually more of a difference in a greenhouse than in the field in those studies, but I think it's usually a similar trend.